In the small, quiet town of Red Rock, Jackson Hale, a cowboy, was riding under the scorching sun when his eyes caught sight of an old, dilapidated shack at the edge of town. From within, he could hear the faint sound of a woman's voice, strained and desperate, as she struggled against two men. Inside the shack, Jessa Orwood, a widow, was being dragged by two men who were forcing her toward the saloon. Jackson immediately felt his blood boil at the sight. Without hesitation, he rode over, dismounted, and approached the men with a purpose. His voice cut through the tension like a knife, commanding the men to release Jessa. With swift action, Jackson used his strength and speed to take down both men, leaving them on the ground in defeat. He then turned to Jessa, who was trembling but stood tall, trying to hold herself together. "You're coming with me," he said firmly, extending his hand to her. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and confusion. But after a pause, she took his hand. Jackson led her away from the saloon and toward the back of the feed store, a safer, quieter space where she could rest for a moment. Jessa explained how the men had worked with her late father and how they were demanding she repay a debt she didn't owe. The weight of her past was clear in her voice, and her weariness from fighting this battle alone was evident. Jackson listened quietly, nodding and understanding, but he wasn't about to let her face this alone any longer. But when Jessa suggested that Jackson leave, he stepped outside for a moment, his gaze turning toward the shack once more. What he saw when he looked back inside stopped him cold. There, sitting on the floor with empty, hollow eyes, were Ella, 4 years old, Sam, 5 years old, and Rosie, 3 years old. The three children eating the last scraps of rotten bread. The image was one of complete despair. Jackson's heart sank as he watched them, their tiny hands shaking as they brought the moldy bread to their mouths. He felt the anger and frustration bubble up inside him. This was no life for them, and he knew he had to do something about it. Jackson couldn't just leave them there. He stepped back inside the shack, his voice steady but firm as he commanded, "Grab your things. You're coming with me." Jessa blinked in surprise, her lips trembling as she tried to protest. But the moment she saw the steely determination in Jackson's eyes, she knew there was no turning back. She gathered her children quickly, and as they left the shack, Ella, Sam, and Rosie clung to her, still unsure of what was happening, but feeling the sudden sense of urgency. Jackson led them to the back of the feed store, where Jessa finally allowed herself a moment of relief. But there was still the lingering question, how would she repay this kindness? Jackson wasn't there for repayment. He was there to help, to give them a chance at something better than what they had been living through. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the barren road as Jackson led Jessa, Ella, 4 years old, Sam, 5 years old, and Rosie, 3 years old, away from the town. Instead of his usual horse, Jackson had prepared a wagon for the journey, a sturdy, old cart with wooden wheels that creaked with every turn. The horses pulling it trotted steadily along the uneven dirt path, their breath clouding in the cool evening air. Jackson drove the wagon, his hands steady on the reins, while Jessa and the children sat close together on the wooden bench, still adjusting to the change. Jessa sat silently beside the children, her eyes distant as she watched the town fade away behind them. She was used to the noise of Red Rock, the clatter of boots on the dirt streets, the shouts of townspeople, and the harshness of life there. But here, with the wide open space stretching out before them, it felt different, quieter. Her thoughts raced as they traveled further away from the life she had known. But there was something peaceful in the stillness of the land. Ella looked up at the vast sky, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's so big here, Mama," she whispered, her voice full of awe. Sam and Rosie were both too quiet, their small faces pressed against their mother's side as they looked around. Rosie clung to her mother's sleeve, her little fingers gripping tightly as if afraid the land would swallow them up. But Ella seemed entranced by the scenery, taking it all in, the wide fields, the distant mountains, and the trees that dotted the horizon. As they moved farther from the town, Jackson glanced over his shoulder at Jessa, noticing her stillness. "You doing all right back there?" he asked, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of concern. Jessa blinked, as if waking from a daydream, and gave him a small nod. "I'm fine. Just trying to wrap my head around all this." Her voice was quiet, distant, and full of unspoken words. "I never thought I'd be running from one place to the next. Not like this." Jackson didn't answer immediately, but his eyes softened as he kept his focus on the road ahead. He knew what it was like to run, to never really settle anywhere. It was a weight that hung on a person's shoulders, heavier than anything you could see. But he had learned that sometimes you had to make the choice to move forward, to leave everything behind and start anew. "You don't have to worry about that anymore," Jackson said after a beat, his voice steady. "You and the kids will be safe. I'll make sure of it." The words were simple, but there was a firmness in his tone that gave Jessa a strange sense of comfort, though she couldn't quite explain why. She was still unsure, still struggling to trust him, trust this new life, trust that safety wasn't just another fleeting illusion. They rode in silence for a while. The only sounds the rhythmic creak of the wagon's wheels and the horse's hooves on the dirt. Jessa kept her eyes on the road, watching the landscape change as they moved into the foothills, the dry earth giving way to soft, uneven ground covered in wild grasses. The quiet was different here, calming, like the world was slowing down just for them. As they continued, Jackson kept his gaze scanning the area, always alert. He was used to being on the move, but with Jessa and her children now under his care, he couldn't afford to let his guard down. He'd seen too much, been through too many struggles himself, to allow anyone to get hurt on his watch. After a couple of hours, they reached the base of the mountains. The air had grown cooler, and the scent of pine filled their lungs as they entered a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest. Jackson glanced back at Jessa again, this time with a more gentle look in his eyes. "We're almost there." Jessa nodded, though her face remained tense. She could feel the shift in the air, the change from the harshness of the town to the peaceful quiet of the mountains. But the weight of her past still clung to her like a shadow. She had to keep reminding herself that this was the beginning of something new, that her children, Ella, Sam, and Rosie, were safe, that they were leaving the past behind, and they had a chance at a fresh start. The road was bumpy, the wagon swaying slightly as the wheels bounced over rocks and tree roots. But after another half hour, they reached the cabin. The small, secluded building sat quietly against the edge of a ridge, surrounded by tall pines and quiet hills. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney, and the view of the mountains beyond was breathtaking. Jessa took a deep breath as she looked at the cabin. It was small, but there was something reassuring about it, something that spoke of solitude and peace. She had lived in a small house before, but nothing like this, nothing so isolated and untouched by the chaos of the world. It felt both strange and comforting, but still, she wasn't sure if it would be enough. She wasn't sure if she could ever feel truly safe again. Jackson slowed the wagon to a stop and jumped down, helping Rosie and Sam down first. Ella followed closely behind, her eyes wide with curiosity as she looked around the area. Jessa hesitated for a moment, but Jackson's steady presence beside her gave her a quiet assurance. "Here we are," Jackson said softly, his hand resting on the back of the wagon. "This is where we'll be for a while." Jessa looked around, taking in the view. She could hear the rustle of leaves in the wind, the soft chirp of birds in the trees. For a moment, it felt as though time had stopped, but her hesitation lingered. This wasn't just a simple change of location. This was the beginning of something new, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. "Is this really yours?" Jessa asked, her voice a little unsure as she looked at him. Jackson nodded. "I built it myself. It's not much, but it's safe." The simplicity of his words, the way he made it sound so matter-of-fact, made Jessa realize that this place, this small, humble cabin was more than just a shelter. It was a refuge, a place where they could be free from the constant threat of danger. And maybe, just maybe, it could be a place where they could heal. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jessa allowed herself to relax just a little. There was still a long road ahead, but for now they were safe. And that was enough. The evening air was cool as Jackson led Jessa, Ella, Sam, and Rosie into the cabin, the warmth of the fire welcoming them inside. The soft crackle of the flames filled the silence, and the scent of pine mixed with the faint odor of wood smoke. The cabin was small, but it had everything they needed: sturdy wooden walls, a bed tucked in the corner, a table, and a few chairs scattered around the room. A small stove in the corner would keep them warm in the winter, and a single window let in a view of the woods and the hills beyond. Jessa stood by the door for a moment, taking in her surroundings. She had never imagined herself in a place like this, remote, isolated, and so far from everything she had ever known. It was quiet here, but there was something about this stillness that was comforting. No more noise from the town, no more oppressive heat and dust, just the soft sounds of nature and the crackling fire. She felt the weight of the day settle into her bones, and for a moment, she was unsure how to react. Part of her wanted to curl up in the corner, shut her eyes, and forget about everything that had led her here. Another part of her was deeply suspicious of Jackson, of this place, and of the quiet calm that seemed to envelop them all. Was it real? Could she truly trust him? Could she trust that this life would be different from the one she had escaped? But as she glanced down at Ella, Sam, and Rosie, all still trying to adjust to the new environment, she knew that she couldn't afford to be wary for long. The children needed her to make a choice. They needed her to find a way to heal, to make this place a home, and to give them a chance at a better life. Jackson stepped forward and started to stoke the fire, adding a few more logs to keep the warmth flowing. He didn't say anything, just moved with a quiet, steady grace. Jessa watched him for a moment, noticing the way his shoulders seemed to carry a weight she couldn't quite understand. There was a quiet strength in him, something that went beyond just the physical. "I'm not used to this," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper as she watched him work. Jackson didn't look up, but nodded, his hands still working at the fire. "You're not the only one, but we get used to it." There was something in his words, something soft but firm, that made Jessa pause. He wasn't just talking about the cabin, or even the quiet life he led. He was talking about survival, about learning to adapt. She could feel his unspoken understanding, and for a brief moment, it was enough to make her feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone. The children, meanwhile, had begun to settle in. Ella had wandered over to the window, looking out at the trees, her small face pressed against the glass. She had always been curious, always looking for something new to discover. Sam was already exploring the small corners of the cabin, finding a few dusty old books stacked on the table, while Rosie clung to Jessa, looking for comfort and safety in her mother's arms. "You can sit down," Jackson said, gesturing to the small wooden chairs near the fire. "I'll get some food ready." Jessa hesitated for a moment, but then she nodded and moved to sit at the table. She hadn't realized how tired she was until she sat down, her muscles aching from the long journey. The stress of the last few days, the fear of being caught, the constant worry about her children, had worn her thin, and now that they were here, safe for the time being, she felt it all catching up with her. She watched Jackson as he moved around the cabin, gathering a few items from the shelves, preparing a simple meal. There was no rush in his movements, no urgency. It was as if he was in no hurry to do anything but simply get through the day. "How long have you been living out here?" Jessa asked, her voice tentative, unsure if she was prying into something personal. Jackson paused for a moment, then shrugged. "Long enough," he said simply. "Long enough to know that peace is hard to come by, but it's worth the wait." There was a quiet strength in his words, something that told Jessa he wasn't just talking about the physical solitude of the cabin. He was talking about something deeper, the emotional distance, the healing that had to happen in the silence, the way the world outside could grind you down until you had nothing left to give. You ever get lonely? Jessa asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper as she looked at him. The question had been on her mind for some time, but she hadn't known how to ask it. Jackson looked at her, his eyes steady and calm. Sometimes, he said simply, but I've learned to live with it. There was no bitterness in his tone, just a quiet acceptance. It struck Jessa how different his attitude was from her own. She had spent so much of her life surrounded by people, by noise, by the constant pressure of survival, but Jackson seemed at peace with it. He had found a way to live in a world that didn't always make sense. The silence between them grew comfortable, and Jessa allowed herself to relax for the first time in days. She could hear Ella and Sam laughing softly in the corner, their voices light and carefree. And for a moment, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this place could be the beginning of something different. Maybe it could be a place to heal. As Jackson set the table with simple food, bread, cheese, and dried meat, he turned back to Jessa. You can stay as long as you need, he said, his voice quiet but firm. No one's going to hurt you here. Not while I'm around. Jessa nodded, though the doubt still lingered in her eyes. She wasn't sure if she believed him completely, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had a choice. She could stay here with Jackson and the children and try to rebuild, or she could leave and face the unknown once again. I'm grateful, she said softly, looking at him with a mixture of uncertainty and thanks. I need time. Jackson smiled slightly, though there was no humor in it, just a quiet understanding. Take all the time you need. There's no rush. As they ate their meal in silence, Jessa realized something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. For the first time in years, maybe even since her husband died, she felt like there was a chance for something better. And for the first time, Ella, Sam, and Rosie had a future that didn't seem so uncertain. The days that followed passed slowly, each one marked by quiet routines. The sun rose early, painting the sky with soft pinks and oranges, while the world outside the cabin came alive with the rustle of trees and the distant calls of birds. Inside, Jessa, Ella, Sam, and Rosie slowly began to settle into the rhythm of their new life. They ate simple meals, worked together to clean the cabin, and started to find small comforts in their surroundings. Jessa had grown accustomed to the steady hum of daily tasks, but something inside her was still uneasy. There was peace here, yes, but there was also an underlying tension, one she couldn't shake. It wasn't just the fear of what might come, but something deeper. She had trusted no one for so long, and now she found herself here, in a place she had never imagined. With Jackson, the man who had rescued her without a second thought, who had stepped in when no one else would. But trust wasn't something that came easily to Jessa, not after everything she had been through. Jackson was always there, steady and reliable. His quiet strength gave her a sense of security she hadn't known in years. He worked without complaint, fixing the roof, chopping wood, and ensuring that they had everything they needed. He never asked for anything in return. And yet, Jessa felt the growing distance between them. He had never once pushed her to talk, to open up, but she could feel his eyes on her sometimes. Eyes that seemed to see through her, to understand her pain without her having to say a word. One morning, as the cabin filled with the light of dawn, Jessa found herself standing by the window, staring out at the hills beyond. The land was rugged, untamed, and beautiful in its own way. She could see the tall pines swaying gently in the breeze, and in the distance, the faint outline of the mountains rising high against the sky. For a moment, the world outside seemed so distant, so separate from everything she had left behind. Something on your mind? Jackson's voice broke the stillness, and Jessa turned to find him standing in the doorway, his eyes soft but observant. She smiled faintly, though the expression didn't reach her eyes. Just thinking, she said, her voice low, about everything, about how different it all is. Jackson walked over, his boots creaking on the wooden floor, and stood beside her. Change is never easy, he said, his voice quiet but steady. But it's better than staying stuck in the past. Jessa nodded slowly, but there was still a weight in her chest, a heaviness that she couldn't shake. She had been running for so long, running from the past, from the men who had threatened her, from the memories of her husband's death, from the feeling that no matter how hard she tried, things would never get better. And now, in this cabin, she found herself standing still, and the stillness felt like a trap. She turned to face him, her brow furrowing slightly. "What if it's not enough?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if this isn't the answer?" Jackson looked at her for a long moment, his gaze steady and understanding. "The answer is what you make of it," he said simply. "This is a place to rest, to heal. You don't have to have all the answers right now. Just take it one day at a time." But Jessa couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she was running out of time. The past was always just a step behind her, and though she wanted to believe that this life could be her future, she feared it wouldn't be enough to erase the scars left by the years of hardship. As the days passed, she found herself becoming more accustomed to the quiet, to the soft sounds of nature that filled the space around them. She worked alongside Jackson, chopping wood, tending to the small garden that had been neglected for so long, and even helping with repairs around cabin. But no matter how much she tried to throw herself into the tasks, the weight of her thoughts remained, lingering in the background of everything she did. One evening, after dinner, Jessa found herself sitting by the fire, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her dress. The warmth from the flames made the room feel cozy, and the smell of burning wood was comforting, but the silence between her and Jackson was heavy. The children had gone to bed early, their small, tired bodies curling up into makeshift beds they had made in the corner. Jackson sat across from her, his eyes never leaving the fire. For a moment, neither of them spoke. But Jessa could feel the pull between them, the growing tension that had been there ever since she arrived. She didn't know what to make of it. She didn't know if she was ready for anything more than just surviving. "You don't talk much, do you?" she asked softly, her voice breaking the silence. Jackson looked up at her, his eyes steady and calm. "I say what needs saying," he replied, his voice low but firm. There was something in the way he spoke, something that made Jessa wonder what he wasn't saying. What was he keeping hidden beneath that quiet exterior? She had learned to read people over the years, to understand when they were hiding something, but Jackson was different. He was an open book, but the pages were filled with silence. And it made her feel like she didn't know him at all, even though he had done more for her than anyone else ever had. She glanced down at her hands, her fingers still twisting the fabric. "I guess I'm just used to people talking more," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Used to hearing everything. The noise, the words, the lies." Jackson's gaze softened, and for a moment, he said nothing. He seemed to be weighing her words, considering them carefully. Finally, he spoke. "Sometimes it's easier to listen to the silence." Jessa lifted her eyes to meet his, and for the first time, she saw something different in his expression. It wasn't just the quiet man she had come to know. It was a man who understood her in a way that no one else did. A man who had his own battles, his own scars, and yet was offering her the kind of peace she hadn't known in years. The room seemed to grow stiller, and for the first time, Jessa didn't feel the weight of her past hanging over her. Maybe this was what she had been running from all along, peace. And maybe, just maybe, peace was something she could learn to accept. The days at the cabin passed with an unexpected calm. Jessa, Ella, Sam, and Rosie had begun to settle into a routine, one that felt both foreign and comforting. The children were adjusting to the quiet, their laughter becoming more frequent, though still tinged with the uncertainty of their past. Jessa found herself working alongside Jackson, her hands growing stronger from the physical labor and her heart, though still guarded, beginning to trust in the safety he had promised. The cabin, though small and humble, was a refuge, a place of peace in the wilderness where the outside world couldn't reach them. The scent of pine and earth filled the air, and at night, the crackle of the fire was the only sound that accompanied the stillness. Jessa had never experienced such peace, not since she was a child, and even then, it had been fleeting. For the first time in years, she could let her guard down, at least most of the time. But just when she thought they were finally free, the past came knocking. It was late one evening when Jackson returned from checking the traps he had set along the creek. The air had turned chilly, and the sun was beginning to dip behind the hills. Jessa was in the cabin, tending to the fire, when she heard the familiar sound of Jackson's boots outside. She felt a strange, unease stir in her chest, though she couldn't quite explain why. "Jackson," she called softly, her voice carried by the evening wind. He stepped inside, his face drawn, the usual calmness in his expression replaced by something more serious. He didn't need to say anything for Jessa to know that something was wrong. "They're back," he said, his voice low and steady, though there was a tightness to it that made Jessa's stomach churn. "Who?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "The men from town," Jackson replied, his jaw clenched. "The ones who were after you." Jessa's heart skipped a beat. She knew, deep down, that they hadn't just disappeared. They would come for her eventually. They always did. She had hoped, even if just for a moment, that she and the children could escape their pasts. But the reality was unavoidable. The danger was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Are they close?" Jessa asked, her voice shaky. She didn't want to think about it, didn't want to believe it was happening again. Jackson nodded, his eyes hard. "There are days right away, maybe less. I'm not sure how they found us, but I'm not taking any chances." The fire crackled softly in the background, its warmth now feeling inadequate against the cold rush of fear that had settled in Jessa's chest. She looked at Jackson, her heart pounding in her ears. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson's gaze softened, but there was a hard edge to his tone. "We leave. We can't stay here. I'll get the wagon ready, and we'll move out before they get too close. You and the kids won't be safe here if they show up." For a moment, Jessa stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The thought of leaving again, of running from her past once more, made her feel like she was trapped in a cycle that would never end. She had been running for so long, always looking over her shoulder, always wondering when the next blow would come. She didn't know if she could do it again, not with Ella, Sam, and Rosie depending on her. But Jackson's steady presence beside her was all the reassurance she needed. He wasn't going to let anything happen to them. He had already proven that by standing up to the men in the town, by offering them shelter and safety. And now, when danger returned, he was offering to protect them again. "All right," Jessa said, taking a deep breath and straightening her shoulders. "We leave." Jackson gave her a small, reassuring nod and moved toward the door. "I'll go check on the horses," he said. "Get the kids ready. We'll leave as soon as we can." Jessa nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision. As she turned to gather Ella, Sam, and Rosie, she knew that this wasn't the end of their journey. They couldn't run forever, but for now, they had to move again. She found Ella and Sam already in the corner of the cabin, their faces full of concern. Rosie was sitting on the floor, playing with a small wooden toy she had found. When she saw her mother, she immediately stood up, her tiny face full of questions. "Are we leaving?" Ella asked, her voice soft but steady. Jessa crouched down to her level, her hands on her daughter's shoulders. "Yes, sweetheart. We're leaving for a little while, but we'll be okay. Jackson's going to keep us safe." "Where are we going?" Sam asked, his voice tinged with both curiosity and apprehension. "We're going to find a safer place," Jessa said, offering them both a reassuring smile, though her heart was heavy with uncertainty. She wasn't sure where they would go, but for now, She had to believe that Jackson knew the way. Rosie clung to her mother's side, her little face filled with confusion. "Why, Mama? I don't want to leave." Jessa kneeled down beside her, smoothing her hair gently. "I know, Rosie. I know. But we have to go. It's not safe here anymore. But we'll stick together, okay?" Rosie nodded, her small hand gripping Jessa's tightly. As the children gathered their things, Jessa couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. They had come so far, and now, once again, they were being forced to run. She had hoped that their days of fear were over, that they could finally build something stable. But fate had other plans. Jackson returned moments later, his face grim. "The wagon's ready. We'll leave as soon as you're ready." Jessa took one last look at the cabin, the place that had been their refuge, their safe haven for a short while. It was hard to leave, but Jessa knew that they had no choice. They couldn't stay here and risk everything for the false sense of safety the cabin offered. With a final deep breath, Jessa took Ella, Sam, and Rosie by the hand, and they followed Jackson outside into the cold night air, ready to leave the life they had known once again. The chill of the early morning air bit at Jessa's skin as she walked alongside Jackson, the weight of the journey ahead settling heavily on her shoulders. The night had been filled with hurried packing and quiet conversations. The cabin they had briefly called home, now a distant memory. As the wagon creaked under the weight of their belongings, Jessa could feel the familiar knot of fear tighten in her chest, though she tried to push it away. The uncertainty of their situation had never been clearer, but as they rode through the quiet, wooded landscape, a part of her felt a strange sense of peace. The trees stood tall and silent around them, like guardians watching over their path. Jackson had already taken charge, organizing their escape with efficiency, his calm demeanor reassuring in the face of danger. Even now, as they moved through the darkened woods, there was something unshakable in him, something steady that Jessa hadn't fully understood until now. There was no fear in his eyes, only determination. And for the first time in a long while, she began to feel like she could trust him, not just with her life, but with the lives of her children. "Do you think they'll follow us?" Jessa asked, her voice low as she glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the men from the town pursuing them. Her heart raced at the thought, and she instinctively tightened her grip on Rosie's hand, who was still clutching her side, her small face full of confusion. "They'll try," Jackson replied, his voice firm. "But we'll be ready for them. We won't stop until we're far enough out that they can't catch us." The determination in his voice was enough to settle Jessa's nerves just slightly. Jackson had always been calm, but this quiet confidence was something different. He wasn't just offering a promise. He was making it clear that they would survive, no matter the cost. They continued on through the night, the sound of the wagon's wheels the only noise breaking the silence of the forest. The journey was slower than it had been when they first left the cabin, but Jessa didn't mind. There was something reassuring about the slowness, as though they were moving away from the dangers of the past and into something new, something that felt, for the first time in years, like it could be theirs. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the trees, they had reached the edge of a quiet valley, far from a town. The land stretched out before them, wild, untouched, and full of possibilities. There were no signs of life, no towns, no looming threats, just the whisper of the wind and the soft rustling of the trees. "We can rest here for the day," Jackson said, pulling the wagon to a stop near a small stream. The horses slowed, their breath visible in the cool morning air. Jessa looked around, her eyes scanning the peaceful surroundings. There was something about this place, the way the light filtered through the trees, the way the sound of the water calmed her mind, that made her feel like they were finally safe. For the first time in weeks, she could breathe. The children, too, seemed to sense the peace of the place. Sam and Ella jumped out of the wagon eagerly, running to the edge of the stream to splash their feet in the water. Rosie, always more reserved, stayed close to Jessa, but her wide eyes filled with wonder as she watched the others play. Jessa took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill her lungs. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was in control. She wasn't running anymore. She was standing still, and for once, that felt like enough. As Jessa stood there, watching her children, Jackson approached her, his movements quiet and deliberate. He had been taking care of the horses, ensuring that they were watered and rested for the journey ahead. When he was close, he stopped and turned to face her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Jessa glanced at him, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. She didn't answer right away, but instead turned to look at Sam and Ella, who were laughing by the water, their worries forgotten in the simplicity of the moment. "I'm better," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. She looked back at Jackson, meeting his eyes. "You've done more for us than anyone ever has. I don't know how to thank you for that." Jackson's gaze softened, and he took a step closer. There was no boastfulness in his expression, just a quiet understanding. "You don't have to thank me. It's not about that." He paused, his voice growing quieter. "It's about what's right. And I think we're both trying to do what's right." Jessa felt something shift between them, a subtle but undeniable connection that went beyond gratitude or obligation. It was a bond that had been forged in the fires of shared struggle, a bond that felt stronger now than ever before. She swallowed, trying to steady her emotions. "I don't know if I can ever repay you for this," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "For everything you've done." "You don't have to," he replied, his voice low but firm. "All I want is for you and the kids to be safe. And for you to know you're not alone anymore." Jessa stared at him for a long moment, her chest tight with emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel in so long. She had spent so many years afraid of trusting anyone, afraid of being hurt again. But here, with Jackson, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. Without thinking, she took a small step toward him, the space between them narrowing until she was close enough to feel the warmth of his presence. He didn't pull away. Instead, he held her gaze, his eyes steady and reassuring. There was no rush, no overwhelming need for grand gestures. Just two people standing together in a moment of quiet understanding. For the first time in a long time, Jessa felt the walls around her heart begin to soften, the barriers she had built slowly crumbling away. She didn't need to say anything. Jackson already knew. "I'm staying," she said quietly, her words simple but full of meaning. "For good. With you." Jackson's expression softened, a quiet smile playing at the corners of his lips. "That's all I need to hear."